Скрывается солнце за степи, вдали золотится ковыл. Холодники звонкой цепи сметают дорожную пыль. Динь-бом,
Even though I have moved away from sort of my family and the hubbub of the Doukhobor practices, in my heart I've never really left it. Some of the beliefs that I honor now and I feel have become part of my own identity are things like pacifism and particular disarmament. I really feel strongly about disarmament. The collage piece that commemorated the Dunblane slaying of 16 children was done in response to that and brought to mind the philosophy that the Doukhobors have held for a long time, that the welfare of the world is not worth the life of one child.
One of my creative writing instructors said to me one day, well, this is a good short story, but to make it really great, change your characters to Doukhobor characters and give them Russian names. And of course, I wasn't self-confident enough to do that at that time because being Doukhobor is to lack confidence because of all the conflicts and things happening and the perception people have of the Doukhobors as a culture. So it took me about 2 or 3 years to realize that maybe this is what I should be doing. You know, once I made that decision, I was sorry I hadn't made it sooner.
When the Doukhobors refused military service and burned all their guns on June the 29th, 1895, they went through quite a bit of persecution. And most of the people then learned this psalm, which gave them a lot of comfort. It was for thy sake, O Lord, that I left all my earthly belongings, that I live in privation and persecution. It is for thy sake, O Lord, that I willingly bear slanderous accusations and degradations. It is for thy sake, O Lord, that I go about in hunger and in thirst. And it is for thy sake, O Lord, that I have to live without shelter. The Lord be praised.
I've been haunted for a long time by images in family photo albums. There's an incredible soul quality and idealistic expression in the faces of the people in the photographs. It's almost as though they led this very idealistic way of life and as though utopia were just around the corner. And I know now that their lives weren't really like that, but what comes through is this incredible idealism, I suppose, in the face of hardship.
I am weary, I weep, I wrap myself in silence, I am alone among friends. I hear the sounds their mouths make, but not their voices. The symbols are in place, but the meaning is gone. This is what comes of wrestling with angels. I think, for Doukhobors, it's more a wrestling with your own spirit. And that is a struggle for moving past what is depressing and into what is sorrowful and joyful both.
Ты знаешь, Боже, мое желание, мои молитвы слышишь ты.
Canada's Doukhobors are the descendants of 18th century Russian pacifists. Their history has been passed on orally through complex hymns sung in archaic Russian. Today, Doukhobor writers and artists are beginning to tell their stories to the outside world.
My father was a great storyteller, and he had a very colorful life, being born in the Caucasus area in one province, and at the age of 2.5 migrating to another province, which he remembered, and then at the age of 21 being called up for army service, which he refused. Then he was exiled to Siberia. The trek to Siberia at that time was a matter of 10,000 kilometers. The Doukhobors that didn't go to Siberia, they all came to Canada. And of course, when my dad and his chums came to Canada 6 years later, there was always these stories that the Siberian exiles could tell. So that got my interest from a small age yet that I would be writing sometimes. There were some books being written about the Doukhobors, and especially there was a lot of newspaper and other media that did not bring out the Doukhobors in a proper light. So I was somehow prompted from my inside to write a book from the Doukhobors themselves rather than somebody write about them. I had chosen then this particular lady, Tanya. She happened to be actually my wife's grandmother's sister. She was born in the first part of the 1870s, and she lived 100 years and then some. So I thought in her life I would bring out the thoughts of the Doukhobors just as they were through her eyes, and the history and the philosophy of the Doukhobors. To a Doukhobor, speaking is a voice of the intellect, singing is the voice of the soul. That is why Doukhobor, it's incumbent upon him to know the things that he's singing by heart, so that it's in your intellect already, and then you can express your soul, sing from your soul. And in order to have group communion of the soul, you sing together. And to sing together is also an expression of how you should live together. If you're singing, then you have to, of needs, go along with the person that's next to you so you don't make a discord. And same with the next person and the next person. And then you have a whole congregation that tries to be in unison. And then that is brought into everyday living. But the Doukhobors feel that you have this soul communion when you get together. Doukhoborism, it could not really be classed as a religion or a social movement. It's the best explanation of it. It is sort of just a life concept that continually has the chance to evolve.
Pacifism is at the heart of the Doukhobor life concept. And it was pacifism that drove the Doukhobors into exile. Persecuted in Russia for their beliefs, the Doukhobors looked for a place of refuge and found it in Canada. 7,000 Russian Doukhobors arrived in 1899, inspired by the promise of religious freedom. The Canadian government needed farmers to settle northern Saskatchewan. Here, the Doukhobors quickly built thriving communities centered at Verrigan, a village named after Peter Verrigan, the beloved Doukhobor leader who first brought them to Canada. The large prayer home at Verrigan still stands, but it's now a museum, a pilgrimage site for modern Doukhobors.
The central area of the Doukhobor, their administration, was right here. And the prayer home was the residence of Peter Verrigan, and this is where he met his business partners. We had a community store, a dry goods store, and a big building here with administration offices. There was a big library. There was a congregation room for meetings. Here there was a barn, and just West of here, of the grounds, was a brick factory. And just south of the brick factory was a bit of a village. And beyond that was a dam, an elevator, and a flour mill. And the train would be able to unload and load and be gone.
These early Doukhobor communities were built on a spiritual foundation and utopian values. The Doukhobors were strict vegetarians. They lived communally, and they rejected private ownership and militarism of any kind. Births and deaths weren't registered for fear of conscription, and marriages weren't registered, as the Doukhobors believed this implied the wrongful ownership of one person by another. Many of their beliefs were to bring conflict to the Doukhobors in Canada. In spite of the early promises of religious freedom, the Canadian government proved harsh and inflexible to those with different ideas. A conflict over land ownership was to nearly destroy the new community. To claim their homesteads, the government insisted the Doukhobors swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen, and would not permit them to register the land communally according to their beliefs. The majority of Doukhobors refused, rejecting private ownership, fearing conscription, and believing their only allegiance could be to God. Over 200,000 acres were lost to these Doukhobors. The government seized the land and offered it for sale to new immigrants. The rush to buy the confiscated land was so large it had to be contained by the RCMP. This conflict was to divide the Doukhobors into three distinct groups. Those who lost their land left for British Columbia, where they became known as the Community Doukhobors. Those who stayed behind were known as independents. A smaller number separated from both these groups. Called the Sons of Freedom, they began almost a century of opposition to assimilation of the Doukhobors. The Sons of Freedom gained public attention for their nude demonstrations and for burning Doukhobor and government property to protest militarism and materialism.
When people ask me how was it that the Sons of Freedom came into being, we have to go back to the days of the persecution in Russia, particularly during the time of their renunciation of militarism. The ones that actually refused, they were flogged in penal battalions. Those that were just had call-up notes that were in reserves, they were exiled. These people, with that kind of a background, living a secluded life, and all that torture when they went through, to be transported into another country, across the ocean, with an alien language, with alien people all around them, they were given all kinds of promises that you can have your own little communes, you can have your own little school, you can have all this, you go ahead and settle, sure, we need farmers here. And then after they had come here and settled, and they found that there was a little bit of an iron glove behind the silk gloves that invited them here. And in 1906 particularly, when they had actually cultivated 225,000 acres of land, cultivated it, the government took them away because they wouldn't take the oath of allegiance to get the homesteads the way they're supposed to. Now, where would that build up trust in governments? If you had to follow the policy of the oath of allegiance and so on, and you had to take this 225,000 acres of land, you had to at least compensate them for breaking that land. You cannot but help that people would get a mistrust of authorities in general, because the inhuman way they've been treated.
After leaving Saskatchewan, the Community Doukhobors rebuilt their villages in southeastern British Columbia and in the Rocky Mountain foothills of Alberta. They lived quietly according to their pacifist principles, and their villages were among some of the most successful communal enterprises North America has seen.
And when I first arrived here from Saskatchewan in 1939, the Doukhobor commune was still in full existence as it had been established by Peter Lordley Verrigan. Every village consisted of two big central homes and many small buildings around it. The older people would not hear of starting to own land individually, but the younger people started owning the plots individually, and so you do have nice homes here and there, but a lot of the villages, there's even no trace of them left. I feel sometimes like Tanya in the book, it does say how she felt when the community was being taken apart in Saskatchewan. She felt very, very, very lonely about it and very sad that the communal way of life had become dismembered. We all feel sad.
Growing up in Kristova in the early 50s, I really wasn't exposed to many art forms, and definitely no visual art forms. During the time when the children were taken away to New Denver from our community, most of my playmates were gone. I had a lot of alone time, and my favorite pastime was drawing, and I drew on the roadway, the unpaved road, and I drew on rocks by the creek and on walls. The walls that were cardboard lined were an easy target for my crayons. And I think as a result of that too, I've developed a closer relationship with nature. When we moved to Bragg Creek some 18 years ago, one of the first things that I did is I joined the Artisan Guild, and very shortly after that I began taking lessons with a man by the name of Stan Parrott. Stan seemed to always see some of my Doukhobor-ness coming through my work, even at times when I didn't see it myself, but he would make comments, and he would say, well, there's that girl, you know, that's the Doukhobor roots coming through there, and which used to amaze me.
And they're in a way portraits, but they aren't.
Exactly. I enrolled at the Alberta College of Art with a particular goal in mind, and that was to honor the Doukhobor heritage in some contemporary way. And I really didn't know how that was going to materialize. And at times I felt very overwhelmed because there seemed to be so much to say about the Doukhobor culture, and at times I felt like I couldn't say anything. I decided that I would turn to my family and see what they could provide me with in terms of Doukhobor artifacts and photographs and some heirlooms. It really became sort of a communal project because it involved the family's support. It was almost as if the grandmothers, the ancient grandmothers, the photographs that I was using were actually helping me, because every day went so smoothly, and things just kept unfolding as they should, and eventually the three wall hangings took on their own personalities and their own themes. One represented more the communal lifestyle, the prayer meetings, the spirituality, the teaching style of repeating over and over the clothing that was worn, the shawl that is so common in our culture and during prayer service, and also the photographs of women holding hands. It is wonderful because it expresses that camaraderie and that communal lifestyle and a sense of community. And the next piece being the one that reflects the Doukhobor culture in general, the rootedness of the culture in the Russian language. I used the Russian alphabet and dyed that into the background, and then the sunflower, the organic nature of the culture and the connectedness to nature and the gardening aspect. And the prayer in the corner is again repeated, because that's how we learn. Is the prayer is Mать Medanyenya, which is a prayer about the Divine Mother. It seemed to all have fit in together and taken on its own meaning. The final piece was reflecting the home, the hopes and the dreams of a family for a young girl's marriage, the preparation of the hope chest, the crocheting, the handiwork, the wedding dress. The home in our community was not always a stable environment. For example, when the children were taken away to New Denver, most of my cousins were gone, so there was that disruptive element, that painful aspect. I just felt that it was important to include that, somehow integrate that aspect into this particular piece, because the Doukhobor culture is not only about handiwork or beautiful colors or tapestries. There's a lot of other history there that is, some of it is very painful and has left a lot of scars in all of us. And so it was a way of speaking about that.
In the 1950s, the Sons of Freedom refused to send their children to public schools, believing the schools taught respect for materialism and militarism, and a lack of respect for the Doukhobor culture. The government apprehended the children and held them for 6 years in a former Japanese internment camp near the small town of New Denver in southeastern British Columbia. This move was not without precedent. In the 1930s, the government created a lengthy prison term for public nudity, specifically designed to stop the Sons of Freedom political protests. Many Freedomites were arrested on this charge, and over 300 of their children were sent to government reform schools, where they were treated as juvenile offenders. Many of these children grew up to become leaders in future Freedomite protests, and several were to have their own children interned at New Denver.
I had a photograph of my mother and her 2 sisters, and all, with the children, myself included, and I was in that picture. I was the baby. Once I had screened that image onto the fabric, the children that were cut away were my cousins that were taken away to New Denver, and just removed them. The removal in itself was very powerful. I got an old article from the Nelson Daily News from that time, which talked about the last time that the school bus went through that community, and that was like the last chance that the government was giving the Freedomites to send their children to school. So I reproduced that on the textile as well. At times it was painful working with some of those memories and some of the images and recalling some of those times. But I found it very healing. I always feel that it's important to shine a light even on the darkest moments of one's history, of one's life.
The seizure of the Sons of Freedom children profoundly affected all Doukhobors, and the collective memory of this sorrow has refused to disappear.
I've decided to write Dead Village Without Children, which is the story of the Sons of Freedom children in New Denver during the 60s, 50s, and 60s, because I had friends who were part of that experience. And I thought that it was a story that should be told. Because I didn't grow up with that background, I was really hesitant to tackle that story. It was a very sensitive issue. The children were not being sent to school. In order to get them to school, the government sent police out to the villages. The children were hidden in various places, and they hunted them down and they dragged them screaming. And as in my story, the children in that story were in a trap door. They would hide, and sometimes they were found and sometimes they weren't. They were just run down like the native children were. The parents were allowed to visit once every 2 weeks, and there was a fence between them all the time. Well, I was born in Verrigan, Saskatchewan on a community farm. And when we arrived in Grand Forks, there was my father had built us a log house in the mountains, miles and miles from town, and we had no vehicle except a horse and wagon and a bicycle. And he settled us there and went to town for the week to teach Russian school. And my mother would milk the cows, and she was stuck in the wilderness with these two little kids, telling us to be careful of cougars and bears. And then, of course, once we started school, we had to move into town because there were no school buses out in the wilderness.
I was the princess.
Mike Baldiguera.
Oh, were you now?
Mike Baldiguera is there, and Shirley Forrester.
Yeah, she's here
today.
Yeah,
she's here too. I saw her.
And then we had a wonderful childhood living between the two cultures and trying to fit in everything into a busy life. The story I'm working on is going to be set in the Brilliant Jam Factory in the late 1930s and early 40s. And it's the story of a young girl that comes from Saskatchewan to work in the Brilliant Jam Factory one summer. Her love affair with a non-Doukhobor boy, and the sad song woven throughout the story. The conductor appeared in the doorway. "Brilliant," he called, walking down the aisle. As he passed my seat, he looked at me without turning his head and gave me a slight wink, then walked on. I clutched my belongings and followed the man in the pinstriped suit off the train. Directly across the road was a huge brick building with a sign in both English and Russian proclaiming that this indeed was the Kootenay Columbia Preserving Works Jam Factory. I was overwhelmed at the vastness of it. The tall chimneys, the buildings clustered around the large rectangular one. A cow lowed somewhere in the fields, and in the distance the faint voices of children called to each other. Gold-tinged dust from unpaved roads hung over the valley. In a nearby garden, a woman's voice was softly singing a song in Russian. "Я вечер в лугах гуляла."
Over the years, conflicts between Doukhobors and Canadian society had continued. Doukhobors were jailed for not registering births and deaths. Children were punished for speaking Russian in school. Doukhobors weren't allowed to vote until the 1950s, and it wasn't until recently that the Doukhobor form of marriage was legally recognized. Conflicts between the government and the Sons of Freedom had also escalated over the years. There were ongoing court battles, protests, and prison sentences for those convicted of arson and nudity. Police surveillance of all Doukhobor communities was extensive, and press coverage emphasized the sensational. Under this pressure, it was painful for many Doukhobors to speak openly about their culture.
When I moved to Vancouver, I didn't talk about being Doukhobor. I worked at the CNR as a stenographer, and I just didn't tell anyone. The very mention of the town where I came from, it was the immediate reaction was, "Oh, you're from Doukhobor country," or "That's where they take their clothes off," or "That's where all this is going on." And of course, there were the roadblocks happening in the Kootenays at the time, and so it was a lot of sensationalism. I just didn't offer any information on my background, and that was all. I just wasn't confident enough. My grandfather was a storyteller and a singer, and he used to roam the mountains looking for lost cattle. And my father was a singer and a playwright and a songwriter. And it was a way of life. So the stories just evolved from that and from my culture and from the space. In my book, the title story is Head Cook at Weddings and Funerals, and she's the woman who presides over the cooking of the all-important borscht, which is the main part of any Doukhobor feast, whether it's a wedding or a funeral. So in this particular story, Marusia is marrying the son of the head cook at weddings and funerals, and her mother, Aunt Florence, is very excited and very thrilled because she thinks she's pulled off this wonderful coup. Her daughter is going to be the daughter-in-law of this important person. Marusia's mother has spent countless hours creating a traditional wedding outfit for her daughter, which is similar to this wedding outfit, which is what I wore for my own wedding. However, to Aunt Florence's utter dismay, Marusia wants to wear a non-traditional wedding gown with a veil from page 352 of Eaton's catalog instead of the traditional outfit her mother has prepared for her. And I call this the wedding gown traumas. I felt a numbness at the time, but thinking about it today, I can recall the divided thoughts I had as Marusia made her appearance. Excitement, because it was so totally unexpected, so deliciously, sinfully disobedient. And the sinking feeling as I saw Mabel Zarubin's shocked expression. Would she take her son, unmarried, and go home, the wedding day over before it had begun? Only Peter seemed oblivious, smiling at his bride, taking her hand. Uncle Fred, his face red all the way up his bald forehead, clasped his hands over his plump stomach, closed his eyes, and began to recite a psalm.
I love this photograph. The way the women's ankles are almost growing out of the ground. They're all positioned identically. The space between the ankles of the women look like they're exactly the same measurement. And then this attempt to fit into Western culture, that their skirts are getting shorter. They've got these sort of 40s looking coats on, fur collars, etc. But then they give themselves away because they're still wearing their kerchiefs. Within the Doukhobor communities, I'm speaking of the communities that were happening around the turn of the century. The Doukhobor woman, if she was large, that was considered an asset. That was a symbol of health, sturdiness, endurance. That would be a woman that a Doukhobor man would marry. So why I was intrigued with that is it made me think about our notions of beauty. I was focusing a lot on just the costumes that these women wore, and what stood out the most was these long skirts. They were considered the finest textiles in North America that they wore, and they probably didn't realize how beautiful they looked on these prairie landscapes, working in these large full skirts.
I remember my grandmother's and mother's days when they had a big wooden kneading tub, we should say, because it was really huge, and they would get up 5 o'clock in the morning on the prairies and light the lamp and mix their bread, because it was a slow yeast, a homemade yeast that in those Depression days you had to economize. And they would mix that bread and bake it out by maybe 10, 11 to 12 in the evening, because it was a slow process. And they would, in the Doukhobor skirts, I remember, and they would be kneading that bread so diligently, so continuous kind of a rhythm, and their skirts would move that way. I used to like to get up for a drink of water and watch them, because as they kneaded, their skirts swayed with them. And to me, that's a childhood memory that I really treasure.
I knew that I wanted to build these large sculptures. I knew that I wanted them to be large, and that was a starting point for me. And I knew that I wanted to make the sculpture out of very simple materials. The Doukhobors have this ability to beautify what's ordinary, and I wanted to do the same. I just wanted to build something that was beautiful with simple materials, and it was done with newspaper and flower paste, and that was it, and a really very minimal amount of color that was added. You know, one side of the family was from the Doukhobor culture, the other side wasn't. So when I was very young, I had a lot of contact with my Russian grandparents and my Russian relatives and the Doukhobor culture, and with a lot of Doukhobor people. And later on, as I was growing up, it seemed in a way that the culture came to visit our family in North Vancouver, i.e. my grandparents. But what I remember about them is that they immediately start working. And my grandmother would get ready to start baking, to do massive baking projects in the kitchen. And so I'd come home from school, and there'd be rows and rows of buns lined up everywhere on top of the fridge, the counters. She basically had taken over the kitchen, and my mother didn't mind at all. My grandfather carved spoons out of wood and made spinning wheels and did a lot of handwork. I think that's a very strong connection that I had with him, that he loved working with his hands, and he was working with his hands all the time. As I was working on the large skirt sculptures, I thought of my great-great-grandmother Fenya and my grandmother Elizabeth as being symbols of the past. And then that took care of two sculptures. And then I thought the third one would be symbolic of perhaps the future. And, you know, where did this vision that Doukhobors had, where was it going to lead? And that's still a question that's unknown. And so the blue skirt, which I called Anna, is symbolic of that and of my own future, and my own future as an artist. The Doukhobors had a very strong vision. They were willing to make sacrifices in the short term for a better life in the long run. How many of us would sacrifice as much as they did? They stood up for what they believed in, even in these adverse situations. These days it would be perhaps standing up for the environment or other issues. Would we take as strong a stand as, say, the Doukhobors had?
Расскажу я всем живущим, как Христос мой пострадал, как под бременем гнетущим на кресте Он умирал. Расскажу я всем живущим, как Христос мой пострадал, как Он всем к Нему идущим мир и радость обещал.
I follow my hunger to the old village and my grandmother's home. The facades have fallen from the old communal houses. Inside, artifacts, treasures from our past. Behind grandmother's house, my cousins are assembled. They have marked out the ground and await me with shovels. It is my honor to break this ground. We will excavate together. It's not like I had sort of decided in some fashion that I was going to be a poet and then started to hone my skills. It wasn't like that at all. I always joke around and tell people that I'm of the convulsive school of poetry, which means to me that actually it's not really a conscious choice that I make, but sometimes, especially when there is something very powerful happening in my life, I sometimes feel like there are no words to talk about it, and then you resort to poetry. Well, this poem actually came out of a conversation that I had with a friend, and we were talking about things that we had inherited from our grandmothers or whatever, like actual things, not just ideas or feelings or teachings, but stuff. Dust. How shall I honor the past? Do I take up the tools my grandmother discarded? What memory makes beautiful will not be contained in an old cracked cup. This treasured, fragile bit of Royal Albert never used. This plaster of Paris cat that held open her door. This teapot my uncle teased her about because he said it should belong to nuns, though she and I knew it was for gypsies. Should those things we sacrifice for love be snatched back by the loved ones? Yet here I am, with my face buried in my grandmother's old skirts, alive with memories, her hard, rough hands, cracked and stained, move gently over my head. My golden hair tangles and clings to her sorrows.
Yeah, my dad, I would think, but it's hard to tell. This is a linen bedspread. Of course, it was, the linen was grown by the Doukhobors and processed by the Doukhobors, hand-spun, hand-woven. So imagine the work. Each step is a lot of work, and then when you put it all together, and then somebody embellished it with crocheting the two pieces together. It's very lovely. Someday I guess these things won't even mean that much to other people. They won't have the emotional connection. Like for me, I remember people who used to do this kind of work. Like I remember the stories they told me and how they would sit for hours and all that kind of thing. So it's more than just a story or a sample of the past. It has a kind of an emotional flavor to it for me. Even the smell. The smell is kind of slightly of mothballs. I love that smell. It's old. It's an old kind of smell.
At first, when we moved to Grand Forks, we moved in with my grandfather and my grandmother. And then even my aunt and her daughter moved in with us too for a little while. And it was really a nice little place to grow up because, all the cousins played together and stuff like that. But it was very difficult, too, because we didn't have indoor plumbing. We didn't have hot and cold water, even. We'd sing and go to Russian school and memorize prayers. And I remember my grandmother, of course, was putting us to bed sometimes, and sometimes my mom, and we would memorize. I remember there was a big competition between my cousins and I who had memorized the most prayers.
I guess they shared the work and they shared the responsibility, and it's not easy working all together like that. Getting a crew together and then nobody's expert and you have to all pull together at the same time. Like it was a big challenge for them.
This was written for a friend, but actually it's inspired by her. It's a true story. She actually told me this, and I think it's such a wonderful tribute to her and to her sensitivity. She's afflicted with great sensitivity. I know a woman whose spirit is constantly urging her to fly. She stopped going to the Sabrania because the collective voices of her people would cause her to lose mass. She could feel her body start to float from the hard wooden bench. It made it so difficult to speak. Each word left her less dense. It made it so dangerous to sing. The sound soaring into the air above their heads pulled her with it. Bowing and kissing each cheek, her chest would feel too full, too ample. The touch of your cheek against her cheek, the hope of your hand in her hand. Her iskra would flare up with willful joy, and she would find herself possessed of a pure and radiant heart. She told me with some sorrow, that she had given up going to the prayer meetings. How could she be one with the people if at the end of each sabrania, the assembled brothers and sisters would feel obliged to reel her from the ceiling and float her out to her car?
I felt I needed to add a few more pieces, and what I still had the screens, the silk screens of the previous images, and again worked with fragments of images and collage, and even photographs of funerals to me were significant to include. Funerals are a very integral part of the Doukhobor culture, and there's certain things that are falling by the wayside that aren't upheld anymore. I think this is something that most ethnic groups in this country are confronted with, and re-examining where they've come from, where they're going, what to retain, what to discard, what is not appropriate any longer, what is of value.
Terrific. Oh, that color was...
So these pieces really speak about those issues.
With my book tours, suddenly I was an unofficial ambassador for my people, and I did a cross-Canada tour last year. People were very interested, and they were very emotional about the story about the Sons of Freedom children. People would cry when I read some of those passages. And one day I got a phone call from Vancouver. A woman was very upset. Her daughter was in New Denver, and she said, "You broke 40 years of silence, and thank you for doing this."
As I was opening up to the work that was ahead of me, there was a reluctance that I didn't quite understand, and I realized later that it was to do with the fact that I felt like I was an outsider of the culture, and that I didn't really belong to it. It really wasn't mine. It was maybe my grandparents or my father's, but it wasn't anything to do with me, because basically I hadn't lived right in the culture, and in the Doukhobor communities I didn't speak Russian. It was just basically me claiming back that part of myself which I'd forgotten about and in a way just lost touch with. The Doukhobor community itself was very encouraging and wanted, almost seemed to need, artists to come out and have something to say about the culture.
Being interviewed in the museum reminds me sometimes when I'm speaking to young people. Being a historian, I refer to the old days, the old times, and sometimes the young people feel that I overemphasize the good things of the past. And he says, the way you speak, we have to just put you in a museum somewhere, because you're always referring to older things that were always good. Some of our young people are leaving the Doukhobor faith and are somehow a bit even ashamed of it. So my understanding of it is that before you change for something new, you should really examine the values that your forefathers had, so that you'd know what you're leaving and what you're changing it for. And that one? Well, you better look after that.
This was my mother's trunk. It was made for her by her own father. I actually just keep old things mostly in it, and treasures, really. It's like a treasure box. It's a tablecloth, I think, somewhere in the bottom there, that again my mother made for her hope chest. It was very beautiful, but all the years I grew up, she never used it once. Not once. It was a special kind of event, like show and tell, but for adults. And my husband was making the display. And so I sent that tablecloth for him to put the display on. And it was kind of put over this very nice table. And then everybody put their treasures on top. It was very emotional for people, and they were all telling their stories about this particular treasure and why they brought that particular treasure. Towards the end, more and more people were breaking down and crying, and then it was my turn, and so the whole atmosphere is very charged. And I had to say, my mom worked on this. This was a great hope. It was for her hope chest, and she had all these visions of what her life would be like, when she got married and had children and so on. And somehow there was never a moment special enough for her to decide, okay, this is special enough, I'm going to use it now. She kept thinking, well, something would come up and it would be more special and she'd use it then. And then she never did use it. And then it was my opportunity, and I had never really used it until this time. And the emotion of saying, wow, I get to share it with you. And all of your treasures are laying on my mother's dreams.
Не сам же я узнал страдания Твое, но, Господи Божий, Тебе благодарю, но, Господи Божий, Тебе благодарю, что Ты надо мною милость оказал, крестное знамение в душе показал, крестное знамение в душе показал. Дай нам подкрепиться в душах и в мольбе, не дай нам остаться в мирской суете, в мирской суете.